Right, Kלים Perek Tes Mishnah Ches, the last Mishnah in the Perek. Now I myself must try and not get confused in this Mishnah. In the previous Mishnah we dealt with a crack, a hole in the tzomit posel. It was a little bit complicated. There was a difference between whether the crack was actually in the mekoyim hachibur, in the actual glue connecting the tanur to the sreda, as opposed to a hole in the sreda itself. And there was machloikas between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yehuda, which one is actually got a more chumrah dikadin. And the same thing carries on with this Mishnah. So let's just hold on and not try and get too confused. Tanur shenikev me'enoi. You have your tanur, and we're now not dealing with the Pesach at the top of the tanur. The tanur has an ayin. It's a little sort of funnel, a chimney sticking out on the side to let the smoke out. And you've got to block that ayin of a tanur to create a tzomit posel. So you block it, you cement it, you put a whole shmirich, a whole maricha in front of it. And now we're dealing with a hole, a crack where it appears, memela, in this maricha. In order to compare this Mishnah with the previous Mishnah, just like in the previous Mishnah we made a chilik between a hole in the maricha itself, the mekoyim hachibur, and a hole in the sreda, here as well, here too, we're going to be mechalik between a hole which appears in the middle of the maricha of the ayin, which is going to be similar to the din of a hole in the sreda itself of Mishnah Zayin. In contrast with the case of nikev mitzidoi, when the hole is actually on the side of the maricha, in other words, at the point of the chibur of the maricha to the ayin. And then the views of the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yehuda are going to match the shittas they held in Mishnah Zayin. Let's start off. Tano shenikev me'enoi. Me'enoi means in the middle of the ayin, you put a layer of cement, of maricha, and then in the middle of that layer of cement, a hole appears. That's going to be similar to the case in the previous Mishnah when it said nistakos sareda, when the lid itself has a hole in it. And there, when the lid itself has a hole, the Tanna Kama was mekel and Rabbi Yehuda was machmir, and the same thing's going to be here, except the shear is going to be a little bit different. Shuroi maloi kush. Kush is a spindle, and the spindle has to fit in, as opposed to a mardea, Mishnah Zayin. Now we're dealing with a kush. The Tanna Kama, we said, is going to be mekel. He says the kush has to be nichnas for yotze, the hole has to be big enough for the kush to go in and out, and doilik, the kush has to be burned, has to be burning, because this kush was often used as a splint, as a way of starting the fire. So the kush has to be able to go in, and if there's a flame, if it's burning, when it goes in and out, the fire mustn't be extinguished. So the hole has to be quite big. And just like in the previous Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda was machmir in the case of the nistakos sreda atzma, here too, he says shaloi doilik. No, the hole has to be a bit smaller. Even if the kush goes in and out and it actually gets extinguished, does not burn, the fire doesn't stay alight, that hole is enough to ruin the tzomit posel. Nikev mitzidoi, this case is going to be compared to the case of the first case in Mishnah Zayin, when the hole appears in the actual chibur. That's what's happening here. The hole is now appearing at the edge of the merecha, right next to the body of the ayin. Because it's appearing at the point of contact of the chibur, we're going to have the same views that we had there, which is that Tanna Kama is now going to be machmir, and Rabbi Yehuda is going to be mekel. Shuroi kimaloi kush, that's the same. But now the Tanna Kama is going to be machmir, and he says nichnas v'yotze shaloi doilik, if the kush can go in and out, even if the fire gets extinguished, that's enough to break the tzomit posel. Rabbi Yehuda is going to be mekel, Rabbi Yehuda omer doilik. The hole has to be big enough for the kush to go in and out and still stay burning. Rabbi Shimon actually follows in the view of the Tanna Kama that the tzad is more chomor than the emtza. Except he says, that chumra and kula doesn't depend on the kush being nichnas shaloi doilik or the kush nichnas doilik. Overall, my two categories are going to be smaller. They are mina emtza nichnas, because remember in the middle he's a bit mekel. The kush has to go in and out. He's not worried about doilik. Doilik is never important. Mina tzad is very chomodik. The kush has to be the size of the kush, even if the kush can't fit in at all, because it's exactly the same size. But basically, Rabbi Shimon has the view of the Tanna Kama that tzad is more chomor than the emtza. Similarly, Rabbi Shimon said the same thing about the lid of a barrel, which had a hole in it. It follows in the same pattern, except instead of using a malay kush, so a malay maradea was used for a tanur, a malay kush was used for the ayin of the tanur, and now we're dealing with a barrel. We're now going to use something else, shiura. The size of the hole is a malay mitzah shniya shel shipoin, the second joint of a stalk of oats. That's the size. And again, we have to make a difference between emtza and tzad, because we hold a tzad, like the Tanna Kama, is more chomor than the emtza. So he says, mina emtza, the malay mitzah shniya shel shipoin nichnas has to go in and out loosely. Mina tzad, we're more machmir when we say, even if it doesn't go in and out loosely, if it's the exact size, ein nichnas, I'm already machmir, we've already broken the tzomit posel. Rabbi Shimon said the same thing with large barrels that have a hole, and we're talking about a hole in the magufa. The same rule applies. Shiura molay mitzah shniya shel koneh. The only difference here, we don't use oats, we use a koneh. Not quite sure what that is. It's the second joint of a koneh, of another type of stalk. Mina emtza nichnas, mina tzad eina nichnas, because we're always more machmir on the whole of the tzad, which is the actual chibur of the tzomit posel. All these complicated dinim up to now, says the Mishnah. These shiurim of Malay Mardea, sorry, not Mardea, the ones in the Mishnah, the ones we just said now, Malay Mitzah Shniya Shel Shipoin and Malay Mitzah Shniya Shel Koneh, are only bisman shenasu leyayin, when this keli with its tzomit posel was made for storing wine. Avad b'nasu l'shar mashkin. Once we're dealing with other mashkin, afidu kol shu tameim, then all holes break the tzomit posel, and then we're going to qualify this rule again. When do we have shurim for wine when the holes were done memela? As soon as a hole was done, even if it was done for wine, it was done actually on purpose with intent to make a hole, then afilu kol shutzmeim, even the smallest hole is able to break the tzomit posel of the keli used, the chavis, or the chatzovim, one of the chatzovim gedolim. That's all dealing with a hole in the maricha or a hole in the lid. Now we're going to deal with a more basic question. What happens if you have a hole in the middle of the doifen akli nikvu? Nikvu means in the middle of the hole, nowhere near the tzomit posel or the lid. In the doifen akli you have a hole. What's the shear for that? What breaks a tzomit posel when you have a hole in the middle of a kli? And the rule is very simple. There's a machlokes Rambam, and Rashi will do the view of the Rambam because that's the easier one. Depends what the kli is for. We've had this before. We had this before in the beginning of Perik Gimel, that a kli cheres becomes tohor if there's a hole in it. But depending what the kli cheres is used for, that would determine the size of the hole. The Mishnah said that if a kli cheres is made for foods, for oichlin, then the shear is a moitzi zayis, size of an olive. The same shear that is used there to be matayr kli cheres is going to be the same shear here to break a tzomit posel. As soon as you have a hole which is matayr the kli cheres, it breaks the tzomit posel. Shurim b'zeisim. He'osei le'mashkin, if the kli cheres is made from mashkin, then there is shurim b'mashkin, just like a kli cheres becomes tar when it has a hole of what's called a koines mashke, which means that the hole is big enough that if you were to press the keli into mashkin would leak into the kli. That same size hole is the hole required to break the tzomit posel. Shurim b'mashkin. If a kli cheres is made for oichlin and for mashkin, then we always go lechumra. Matilin oisoi lechumroi. Now, In the case when we want to determine whether Kli Cheres is Makabel Tumah, of course we say the hole has to be big, has to be the shear of a zayis. Only then do we say the Kli is Tahir. But for this case in Summit Posel, when the hole isn't acting as a kula, the hole is acting as a chumrah because the hole is breaking the Kli, breaking the Summit Posel rules, you go to chumrah, so it'll end up with the shear of a koines mashke. Of course, this rule will only be relevant to things that find themselves inside the Kli Cheres. Because the Kli Cheres itself, which has this hole, when monafshach is tahir. If you go bosa the oichlim rule, then this hole isn't big enough. So therefore the Kli Cheres is still nitzel with the tzomid posel. If you go bosa the mashkin rule, and the tzomid posel is broken, but going bosa the mashkin rule also tells you that the Kli Cheres can't be mekabel tumah because it's a broken Kli Cheres. So this rule that the Mishnah says that you go with Tzomid Posel, B'konis Mashke L'chumra, is only relevant when determining the rules of Tzomid Posel to allow the Kli Cheres to be matzel, things inside it, like Ochlin and Mashkin that find themselves inside the Tzomid Posel in an Oilames. Okay, that was quite a difficult last Mishnah, and that's the end of Perek Tes.